What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Just wanted to remind you guys to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you end up enjoying this video. That goes a long way to helping the videos do well and making sure I can continue making daily videos for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as I love reading your guys' thoughts on the stories therein. Without further ado, I'll let you enjoy the next hour of true scary stories, and I'll see you guys again at the end of the video. My boyfriend Jason, 27 and male, and I, 23 and female, went on a month-long camping trip to multiple states. Everything had been going really well actually, all the way until October 9th at least. We decided to ditch a campground reservation and instead randomly pitch our tent near Albion Basin in the Uinta Mountains, Alta, Utah. Not far off the trailhead, we parked our car around 3 p.m. at the Albion Basin campground. It was closed for the season. Admittedly, the atmosphere was a little bit tense because this was our first dispersed camping attempt and we had no proper backpacking gear. Upon arrival, we realized the area we wanted to pitch our tent in was about 2 miles uphill. At this point, we started to express regret. I was wondering why we had a planned campsite in Nephi, Utah that we decided to just skip on a whim. After grumping around a bit though and having a large lunch to avoid packing food, we packed our backpacks with the best gear we had to get going through the night, as it was going to be 25 degrees Fahrenheit. We set out up the trail, seeing the occasional family or couple heading back down the mountain. As we trudged on further, we both started to feel a bit strange though. We didn't really even know why we were doing this. We could have just gotten a hotel instead of trying to play backpackers for the night, but we both felt like we had something to prove on our trip, I guess, so we continued nonetheless. Fast forward, and we finally made it up to Creekret Lake. Totally empty. Nothing like the pictures. It was actually kind of eerie how quiet it was. Whatever. We kept hiking up and up in an attempt for seclusion and flat land. When we finally stumbled upon a decent clearing, I could see a small cave in the distance. I pointed it out to Jason to see if it seemed like a good place to stay and check out. He said it seemed like a small animal crawl space. No biggie. We set up as nightfall was quickly approaching, played some cards, bundled up together, and decided to go to bed early around 8:30. We planned to leave as soon as possible in the morning, maybe 5 a.m. or so. We both settled down and eventually fell asleep, but after what felt like 30 minutes, I woke up abruptly at 11:24. I woke up with a feeling I'd never experienced before. I shot wide awake, scared but unprovoked. There was no way I was going to be able to fall back asleep, even though I could sleep anywhere and sleep through the night usually. Jason was still snoring though, so I let him be and just laid there, alert, trying to listen to anything I could make out. There was nothing. It was particularly silent. Around 30 minutes later, Jason woke up as well, much to my delight as I didn't want to be awake alone anymore. I told him I couldn't sleep. He suggested I just rest my eyes as we were leaving soon enough anyway. I didn't want to be a baby and say I was scared though. This was very short-lived, as Jason found himself unable to fall back asleep either. We ended up laying there together, just listening to the sounds of the night. Eventually, I ended up blurting out that I was extremely scared. We agreed it was fine for us to just stick it through the night, as now it was already 2:30. We had a small axe and a pellet gun for protection, so he tried to reassure me I didn't need to be frightened. Not even 5 full minutes later though, we were still wide awake, when Jason's head perked up so fast my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. "What is it?" I whispered. "Shh, listen." I shit you not, I could hear the sound of gravel crunching on someone's boots as they walked around our tent, stopped, and then walked to the side I was sitting on. I felt the blood drain out of my face in an instant. In real time, this all occurred in no more than 10 seconds. but my mind flashed a million thoughts a millisecond. I was convinced it was a ranger coming to arrest us for camping here or something. I called out feebly, "Hello?" I could hear the footsteps moving around us once more. Within 2 to 3 seconds of hearing this, Jason grabbed the gun and burst out of the tent for any chance to confront this person. We knew exactly what we were hearing, but there was nobody there. As soon as Jason got out of the tent, me bursting after him, there was nothing there. We'd heard someone walking around us so clearly, but somehow they'd managed to sneak away and hide in just a moment. Hardly exchanging 2 words, we packed up the stuff we could, looking over our shoulders terrified. We could feel we were being watched. We booked it back down the mountain, with only the moonlight guiding our way. We were too scared to turn off our flashlights. It was the worst 20 to 30 minutes of my life, half expecting to look over my shoulder and find some person stalking us through the woods. When we made it to our car, we locked the doors up first thing and started the descent out of the mountains, speechless and scared out of our minds. We reached town at about 3:30 and slept in a well-lit parking lot of a grocery store. We've obviously since discussed what happened that night, and we're both haunted by the memories of those footsteps. I once had a bit of a self-rescue I had to do in the Laramie Peak Range. I lost all my gear, map, and shelter in a windstorm. Took me a few days to get out, and had a couple of deeply unpleasant experiences along the way. This isn't that story though. It sucked ass, but it wasn't all that scary. I managed to keep a cool head. Typically, that's who I am, the person who stays calm in a crisis. I mention that to let you know how unusual this was to make me freak out and completely lose my cool. This time I had all my gear, but I just couldn't keep it together. There are a lot of cool little trails in Colorado, some well known to the public and some that you'd only know if you were a local. There are mountains and forests for days out there. In 2013, we got some torrential downpours in September along the eastern slope. It was squelchy as shit for a while, and a glorious mushrooming boom happened because of it. I love mushrooms. My favorite thing is foraging. My absolute favorite is Boletus rubriceps. The conditions weren't exactly right, but I thought, why not? Give it a shot, you know? The area I liked to forage in, I'll say it did have some native hazel, some actually fruiting manzanita, watermelon berry, currants, rose ships, raspberries, strawberries, frequently oysters, morels, hawk wings, puffballs, milky caps, chicken of the woods, chicken of the road, chanterelles too. Lots of different kinds of mushrooms I've found in the region. For someone like me, it's a wonderful paradise. I could disperse to camp there easily. That was where I went after these storms. No brainer. Now it was fall. Even if somewhat early fall, I knew that Yogi and Boo Boo were going to be out stuffing it for the winter. I carried my bear spray because of this, and my uncle's lever-action 44 Mag Henry. My girlfriend at the time was supposed to come too, but she couldn't get off work. Solo it was going to be. I figured I could practice some firecraft, maybe build a chair or a smoker or something, and just have a nice few days to myself. I went up early in the morning, hiked about 7 miles in, set up my shelter, and set up to enjoy the rare luxury of a real fire in Colorado. A while later, I started to do my stuff. Set up a couple rods with bells, got out my baskets to forage, and set up my dryer and its shelter far away from my sleeping tarp. I was squelching around with my foraging gear out in a few minutes and having an absolute blast. I was marching happily along, pretty much oblivious to anything else until dusk. Then I pulled out my headlamp and kept going well past what I should have. Damn did I get a good haul though. It was an incredible spread. I left plenty out for the woodland critters to enjoy too. I got back to my camp, started cleaning and drying the mushrooms, and didn't get to my dinner until about 1 in the morning. I caught 2 brook trout of reasonable size as well. Got 'em, let 'em hang out in a bug net near the creek for the next day. I figured it was cold enough that it would be okay. I got back to my little dinky tarp shelter around 3 a.m. I went back inside, toweled off, and passed out. A day very happily spent. I woke up at around 10 a.m. or so the next day. The woods were eerily silent. No birds, no sound of bugs, not even the wind in the branches. Just the sound of a nearby brook gurgling, and that was it. Usually, there'd be at least some animal sounds. I decided to be cautious when going about my business this time. My camp was exactly as I had left it, except for two things. First, there was a branch about 2 feet long, thick as my wrist, laid against a tree my pack was tied to. It had been gnawed on both ends, sort of like a beaver, but the teeth marks looked different. I'd heard of beavers doing this before, but I'd never seen it myself. Somebody had to have left it there, but to what end, I had no idea. Unsettling? Sure. Freaky? Not really. I wasn't scared. Actually, my first thought was I must have accidentally picked it up and forgotten about it or something. Maybe I'd been playing around with it while fishing earlier or something like that and just forgotten. I went to collect those fish, speaking of. Hopefully, they'd still be there and not rotten or nasty yet. I got into sight of them, or rather, the bug nets they were in, and of course, they were gone. Bug net was loose but intact and empty. The fish heads were still hanging there oddly enough, but the rest of the fish were gone. Okay, maybe another person stealing my things then. Somebody was really giving me the Scooby-Doo treatment. I had a bunch of charcoal left over from the fire. There was a nice big rock next to my fishing spot, so I scrawled a message on there. If you're hungry, next time stop by and say hi. I'll share my meal with you instead. I put an arrow pointing roughly towards my camp. I was more grumpy than anything. I guess they'd left that weird branch as a trade for my fish or something. I was very confused. I went to check on my collection of precious shrooms and my berry cooler. Lo and behold, everything was untouched. However, I hadn't swept out any of the debris beneath it. I mean, why bother? Well, now, there was nothing underneath my tarp. It had been cleaned for me. Weird again. I started looking more seriously for some tracks and found nothing. I wasn't here to play junior detective, though. I was here to frolic in the woodlands to my heart's content and collect unreasonable amounts of mushrooms. God damn it. I shook it off and went back to the creek to set up my lines again, only to notice my bells were now gone too. I couldn't remember if they had been there that morning or not. I assumed they must have been taken the previous night. I had only tied the rods to trees after all, so it was easy grabbing. I went back to my tarp, still confused as ever. I made some food, coffee, and decided to still go about my business. Now, here's a somewhat embarrassing thing I do. I know to make noise in the woods if bears are around, and I like to sing. It isn't the same as singing well, mind you. By and large, I sung whatever had been playing on the speakers at my job. Lady Gaga, Katy Perry, Florence and the Machine, Lord, you get the picture. Don't judge me. This stuff is designed to be catchy. I went back on my rounds and found some more rare mushrooms. A rare treat, actually. Some fire morels and ash morels. I was really excited. Hundreds of them. Super late for them to show up in season 2. They were my absolute favorite. I set out collecting some and kept myself company by singing. I was singing Bad Romance or something. All of a sudden, out in the woods, I heard what sounded like someone trying to harmonize with me. I'm a bass. This was a higher tenor or alto voice, muted by the distance a little. It was also completely and undeniably wrong. Scratchy, almost buzzy, weird syllables, clipped and disjointed, a little off-key and off-rhythm as well. Basically, I'm pointing out it was very uncanny valley sounding. I shut up immediately and froze. The singing continued for a moment, and then stopped as well. I was now experiencing a little bit of what my friends called pucker butt. I started to slowly reach back behind me for my Henry on its strap. I heard a sudden yelp or something, then some rustling from somewhere uphill of me behind the tree line. I took a few breaths, assuming I'd just freaked out the other party as much as they did me. I tried to force myself to relax. I kept these small binoculars on me. I took them out and scanned the tree line, but I couldn't see anything. This was probably whoever had taken my fish and my bells. Someone squatting out here in the woods, maybe. I was trying to keep my head on a swivel, but if they were going to be a problem, I feel like they would have already confronted me. They could have even taken a pot shot at me from the woods if they wanted to. It occurred to me finally that I may have just been hearing a weird echo or something. I convinced myself of this to give myself a bit more peace and calm than I had a few minutes before. Although, that didn't explain the yelp though. I guess it could have been a normal animal doing something in the woods though. Hooray for rationalizing things away. I decided that was enough mushrooms for now though. I didn't want to be drying them after dark after this experience. I headed back to camp and got to making that happen. Am I a moron? Maybe, possibly. I really didn't want to go home though. I was really having the time of my life here. I'd grown up in high deserts my whole life, and getting to see so much green that late in the year was a real treat. I wanted to stay. Creepy bullshit be damned. I'd had moments where my brain had tricked me in the past. I talked myself into believing that was happening once more. I kept on singing to myself, this time a bit more quietly than before though. Then it happened again though. From somewhere a bit closer this time, that weird buzzy higher voice joined in. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. I know this probably just sounds creepy because I thought I was alone, but it's hard to convey just how off-sounding this voice was too. They were fairly close to what I had been singing, but like it was coming out of a culvert or something. Just buzzy and clicking and hoarse sounding, like something was wrong with their throat. I was not having this at all. I shut up immediately again. This time I pulled my gun off my back and searched around me. This had to be someone fucking with me now. Not unheard of for good foraging spots, but this was my first time. The singing continued for a moment again after I stopped. Uphill, further in the woods, and definitely in a direction I hadn't been in yet. I called out and announced myself. I asked them to answer me. Nothing. Complete silence now. Since I was listening a bit closer too, I noticed it once more. No animal sounds, no bugs buzzing. My head felt a little bit hazy. I was beginning to get really concerned now. It even looked like a storm might be rolling in too. Bingo. I headed a bit over to a clearing nearby, and for sure I could see a storm rolling in. As always, it was hard to judge the speed. It wouldn't be a bad idea to reconfigure my tarp though, and consider taking shelter early. Again, now with a little more peace with the voice and presence gone. I figured any more bullshit from my neighbor in a bad thunderstorm was going to be far less likely. I went back to my fishing rods and lucked out. I had caught an even bigger trout than the night before. I collected some water for the next day, packed up my foraging stuff, lashed it all to a trunk, and decided to call it there before dusk and the storm was on its way in. I set up my tarp lower to the ground, a more wind-resistant configuration. I set up a spare older one as a kind of rain fly over the entrance as well. It's worth noting this was a fairly thin setup facing the clearing, since the worst of the wind would be coming from there. It pretty much blocked my view. I did another Widowmaker check though. All good, made some hot cocoa and tucked in, just as it was starting to come down, and it came down real hard. I had to put in earplugs to keep my ears from being hurt by the lightning. It was very frequent and loud. I didn't stay particularly dry, and I didn't get much sleep either. It was already one of the most unpleasant and awe-inspiring nights I'd ever had in the wild. Somewhere in the middle of the night, though, I thought I felt something bounce off my tarp, kind of behind me. Not weird, it happens sometimes in storms. A few minutes later, though, I saw something else. A stone, about the size of my fist, bouncing off the tarp, off the rainfly and landing right in front of me. I turned my headlamp on. Sure as shit, it was a rock. Not just any rock either. A rock from the river. Rocks don't just fall off trees. If this storm had picked this round one up from the river, it should have been airborne. Another one, a few minutes later. Somebody was throwing rocks at me. What should I do? Investigate? I had my gun on me, and if shit was gonna go down, I was about as ready as I could ever be. I turned my headlamp back off. Then I got treated to pretty much the most awe-inspiring amount of lightning I'd ever seen in my life. The sky was lit up for seconds at a time. My earplugs couldn't even protect me from the thunder. My ears were ringing. I kept seeing the trees from the edge of the tree line,
and the clearing projected in shadowy form over my rainfly, dancing this way and that. I couldn't look away. At one moment though, as the lightning was flashing, I clearly saw what looked just like a person hiding in the tree line, outlined against the trees and my rainfly by the lightning. They were walking strangely, not running from cover to cover, but kind of strolling back and forth like a drunk person trying to be sneaky. The silhouette wasn't bulky. For some reason, I got the impression they weren't wearing clothes at all. The figure stopped. Whether or not they were facing me, I couldn't quite tell you, but I felt watched right now and very exposed. The figure stood there behind a tree, swaying back and forth, maybe being pushed around by the winds even. I got little glimpses here and there as the lightning flashed. They didn't appear to be doing anything, but standing there and staring at my tent. It was pretty freaky. I readied my gun in front of me. I then had another rock land on my tarp, bounce off and land right in front of me. This was a bad moment. The lightning stopped for just a moment. The thunder died down too. I had a horrible, slow realization that there might be more than one person out there. Then I heard cutting through the ringing in my ears and the momentary silence, clear as it had been earlier, but sounding much closer. The singing of that song I had been singing before. Then it was nothing. I looked back and realized the figure was now not being projected by the lightning anymore. Now that there was a lull, there was complete darkness. I just remember thinking I was fucked to myself in my head. Basically, I was going to have to crawl out of my tarp to get on my feet even. There was no way I was going to be able to stay there anymore. I counted down from 10. I rushed out as quickly as I could and readied my gun once more. I yelled out into the forest, "You better stop messing with me! I'm armed!" And was not in a good headspace. I was as freaked out as I could have been at this point. This was not that long after another creepy experience in the woods. I was about ready to shit myself. I looked around the back of my tent with my light and didn't see anything. Nobody. Just rain raining down. I walked a bit further. I couldn't see anybody still. I could clearly see into the clearing until my light got swallowed up by the rain. I walked around the edge of my little camp, patrolling and sticking close to my tent. I couldn't make out any figures. I wish I could say I checked out the tree line too, but I was too scared. I tried to yell again, but my voice was locked up in my throat. All of a sudden, another rock flew and landed right next to my foot. Bounced off, actually. I won't lie to you, I lost it in that moment. I fired my gun into the dirt about 10 feet in front of me. I could hear some rustling out in the woods, uphill from me yet again. I yelled some dumb panicked bullshit. I ducked back into my tarp and wrapped up as much as I could, huddled up with my gun. Eventually, the storm broke, followed by dawn. I packed up my shit and rushed out of there. I was pretty shaky. It took me a while to get all my various gear and my shelter as well. I took a few moments to look at the stones that had been thrown at me. They were really thick. When I went to grab the last of my things, I noticed there were 2 little sections of wood with chewed ends, stripped just like before, leaning against the trunk right next to my tent. Nope, not okay. It took me a second to get my things. I was that freaked out that I was now afraid of simple sticks. 1 the first night, 2 the second? No, fuck that. I got myself under control, only to notice a powerful sense of being watched. I shook off the cover, packed it in a dry bag, and turned around to get the hell out of there. Then I saw a whole, very dead rabbit on the back edge of my camp. The rain had washed off any leakage that would have been on it, but the carcass was splayed out there, like somebody had thrown it at me and it had bounced off. It was fresh enough it didn't stink. I won't paint you any more the picture. I was instantly and totally numb. At that point, I just panicked and fled from there. I readied my gun the entire way too, and jogged pointing it out into the forest until I couldn't anymore. I breathlessly walked the rest of the way back to my car. I got in, drove about 20 minutes, and then had to pull over and throw up as I had a panic attack. I've never been back there alone, and definitely not unarmed. Like many, I've been quarantining in my house in California. mostly spending the time hopping on work calls and gaining a bunch of weight. One night last month, though, it was around 10:30 and I was simply eating dinner. I live in a rural area where houses are spaced much farther apart. The main town square has got to be at least 2 miles from where I live. That's where the police department is as well. So suddenly, I get a knock at the door. Odd at this hour, but I opened it anyways. I was expecting a package at the time. Instead of a package though, there were 3 men dressed in these dirty yellow hazmat suit things with face shields as well. I was obviously taken aback. I mumbled something like, hello? One guy was holding a clipboard and introduced themselves as a disinfection team sent by the county. Groups of them had apparently been going around the towns in that county to inspect the houses and make sure they were sanitized or whatever. I was not buying this. I asked them to give me a moment. I shut the door and called my neighbor. I asked him about this disinfection team. He told me it must be a scam and to ask for a warrant or call the cops right away. I went back to the door only to see the men were now gone. I walked out into my driveway, completely baffled. I glanced up and down the street. No cars in sight either, just the warm night air. I contemplated calling the police for a moment, but I didn't think it was worth it. I went back inside and simply locked all my windows and doors instead, heading upstairs to watch some TV. About an hour later, still watching TV, I began to hear things falling over in my backyard on the patio. I heard it clear as day because the patio was right below my bedroom window, which had been left wide open. I was too scared to check it out myself. Instead, I stuck my head out the window to look around a bit. I nearly died on the spot when I saw one of those same men in the hazmat suits messing with my back door. I reacted as quickly as I could. "Hey asshole, the cops are already on their way." That sure got his attention. He yelled something unintelligible and hopped the backyard fence. I saw those 2 other fuckers running from around the side of my house. They jumped the fence too and ran off into the woods beyond my home. I picked up my phone from the nightstand and called my local police, explaining the situation. Because of the bright yellow in their figures, I could see them disappearing farther out into the woods. The cops came and we made a creepy discovery. The 2 guys who had been at the side of my house had been trying to pry my dining room window open with a crowbar. I asked them if they could check for fingerprints. I shit you not. One of the officers responded with, "What, you think we're the CIA or something?" That really pissed me off. It seemed small-town police officers really don't give a shit. At least the ones where I live don't. After I insisted, it turned out the men had been wearing gloves anyways, so I guess it didn't matter. Let this be a lesson, and I hope no one else will fall victim to this kind of scam. This happened 3 nights ago, and I'm going crazy trying to figure out what it's about. I had just moved into a new apartment 1 month ago. I'm still unpacking even and settling in. I'd been using my parents' address as my mailing address. They lived a few towns over, about 20 minutes away. I'd been doing so all my life pretty much. Just 3 nights ago, my parents called me at 2 a.m., freaked out, and proceeded to tell me this story. Apparently, at 1 in the morning, someone began frantically banging on their front door and repeatedly ringing their doorbell. My stepdad walked downstairs and opened the door, leaving the front door locked and closed. There was a man standing outside who looked to be in his 30s, a black hoodie on with the hood pulled up all the way over his face. He didn't have any distinguishing features, facial hair, or tattoos. The only thing my stepdad said was that he looked to be Hispanic. Neither of my parents recognized the man. The man started by saying this: "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for my full name." My stepdad played dumb and asked him who that was. The man proceeded to state my full name again and told them that my boyfriend was worried because I didn't come home that night. He claimed to be a friend of my boyfriend and told my stepdad they were both out looking for me, worried because I hadn't showed up. I don't have a boyfriend. I live by myself with my 3 dogs and haven't been in a relationship in quite a long time. Here's the weirdest part though. My stepdad asked the guy what boyfriend he was talking about. The man told him the exact full name of a boyfriend I'd had when I was in 10th grade, nearly 20 years ago. He said my high school boyfriend's name a few more times to ensure my stepdad heard him and repeated that they were very worried about me. Was my stepdad sure I was not inside? At this point, of course, my stepdad was weirded out. He slammed the door and locked it in the guy's face, but the man didn't leave. He lingered in front of my parents' house for several minutes, smoking cigarettes and calling someone on the phone. Finally, my parents called the cops. About 5 minutes before the police arrived, the man walked down to a dead end on their block and drove away in a non-distinct silver car. The car also didn't have a license plate. My parents filed a police report, but nothing else happened. After I heard this story, I'm going nuts over the weird details. How would someone know who I dated nearly 20 years ago? And what would the motive be of making up a story that included that weird detail about my past? I've not been in contact with that particular guy in over a decade. Yesterday, I decided to message him on Facebook to see if this had anything to do with him. I told him the whole story, and he was just as confused as I was. He even claimed to have no part in it and showed me proof of what he was doing as well. I'm at a complete loss. I'm also really freaked out some strange man is going through so much trouble at 1 a.m. to search for me. Any insight or ideas would be greatly appreciated. Thankfully, nothing weird has happened since then.
This happened about a decade ago, and it still scares me. My great aunt lived alone in a small 2-floor Cape house one town over. My grandfather had built it for her in the 1940s. She had a tiny spare bedroom and a writing office upstairs. My great aunt was a nun and a teacher, and would often write friends, former students, and work on a book of her stories that she never quite managed to finish up there. My mother and I would visit from time to time to help take care of the chores in and around the house as the years continued to go on. When I left for college, my mother started visiting more often. No sense in both of them being left alone, she told me. Whilst I was away, unfortunately, my great aunt started showing signs of dementia that progressed quite steadily. It started with stories she'd tell us for the 1000th time, even though we already knew them well. One would start when she and my grandfather were kids, then somehow resolve with her as an adult. Basically, she'd combine unrelated stories into one, leaving her extremely confused afterwards. She also started forgetting to eat, take her meds, and would crank up the heat in the summer to the point she'd be extremely dehydrated. Some days were worse than others, so when I finished college, we started visiting nearly daily. She absolutely refused going to an assisted living home. We set up Meals on Wheels and asked some of her friends and former neighbors to come by, so we wouldn't be the only ones taking care of her. My mother and I also convinced her to start writing in the kitchen rather than upstairs instead, to prevent her from having an accident on the stairs. Without a reason to go upstairs any longer, we shut off the old 2nd floor heaters and closed the overpainted squeaky door to the stairs. We'd find the door cracked open every so often, but my aunt insisted she didn't go up there anymore. We weren't the only ones stopping by though, so maybe someone had fetched something upstairs and forgotten to close it. Again, my great aunt was a nun, so around the holidays she'd roll out the more religious stories and talk about God quite a lot. One day, when I happened to be visiting her alone, she started reflecting on her life, mortality, and when the man upstairs was going to come for her. I changed the subject as it was quite uncomfortable, but over time she started talking more about when she'd die. He's going to come for me soon. I don't know when the man upstairs will do it though. I tried to reassure her. Auntie, I'm sure you have many years left. God isn't going to come take you anytime soon.
with the most serious expression I'd ever seen on her sweet old face. She said, "No, not God, the man upstairs." Around this point in time, she started seeing things, flashes or spiders that weren't there, even a little boy in her living room that only she could see, even when my mom and I were visiting. Initially, I chalked this statement up to dementia. Later that week, snow fell, so after shoveling myself out early, I went to my great aunt's to shovel her walkway for my mom, who'd be visiting later. After shoveling a bit, I called her from my warm car so she'd know it was taken care of. I also said I wasn't coming in, as I had to go to work. She thanked me, and I drove off. I noticed I'd forgotten my rock salt I had used on the walkway though, so I decided to circle the block and pick it up real quick. As I was reaching over for it, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. The second floor light in the old writing office had just turned on. I glanced over quickly, then pretended I hadn't seen it. I ran to my car and went down the road a short ways, confirming in my mirrors that it was still on, and I called my mom. "Hey Mom, can you call Auntie and see if she has anyone over? Don't say I asked, by the way. Let me know how long it takes her to pick up." My mom called back almost immediately. "No, she doesn't have company over, not this early. She picked up right away, why?" "You need to call the police right now. The light upstairs turned on after I talked to her. There's no way a 95-year-old lady hung up, hustled upstairs, and went back down to pick up your call right away." As my mom called the police, I called my aunt once again. "Hey Auntie, I almost forgot, you have a doctor's appointment today. I'll come pick you up, okay? We can grab a hot chocolate before we head on over." I parked my car in front of the house and acted as normally as I could. It felt like an eternity, helping her get her house coat on and out the door. As I turned the lock, I heard footsteps above us on the second floor room, where I'd seen the light turn on. I helped her into my car quickly, not once looking back at the house, too scared for what I'd see in the window. We shot down the road a bit, and I called my mom again. She was already on her way over, and said the police would be by shortly as well. I told her where I parked, and I waited. She arrived, and the police weren't far behind her. I flagged down the cop when he got closer, and told him what I'd seen and heard. He radioed for 2 more cars. My mom stayed with our great aunt to keep her calm, as the police now surrounded her house. I handed them the keys to the doors. 2 went in, as the 3rd cop and I stayed outside. A few tense moments passed, and the 2 officers returned with a disheveled, gaunt man, wrapped up in handcuffs. "Oh, that's the man upstairs," my aunt said to my mother, onlooking as they fought with this crazed man to get him into the back of one of the cruisers. Apparently, she had accidentally let a disturbed homeless man in, thinking he was the Meals on Wheels guy. He had been secretly living upstairs this entire time. My great aunt hadn't even known if he was real or not. When we were allowed back in, we saw that the upstairs was a complete mess. Garbage, rotting food stolen from the kitchen, and the amount of filth was scary. And the creepiest things, though, were the notes, written many, maybe hundreds of times in different inks and pencil scrawlings around the writing office window that overlooked her walkway, was, "Go away. Don't stay. I'll come down." The back of the door to the stairs had notes too. "She can see me, but you can't. I can see you." It was clear he had probably written notes each time someone visited over the weeks and possibly months he had been staying there. My great aunt was temporarily shocked, but it was quickly forgotten given her condition. She would ask about the man upstairs less and less. The homeless man, who was in poor physical and mental health himself, was hospitalized and unfortunately passed after a few weeks later into the winter. Apparently he had escaped and died in the snow. Very unfortunate circumstances. My mom and I told my auntie a couple of weeks later when we found out. "Oh, I know. He told me last night. He's upstairs again, but you guys can't see him now." At that instant, my mom and I heard the door to the stairs squeak open, and we decided never to go up there again. So this happened to me about 4 years ago.
At the time, I was 20 years old. It was during a tattoo convention in Toronto. I was still an apprentice artist back then, and this was my first time working at a convention. I was super excited, but also a bit underprepared. There were 6 of us going from the studio I worked in, 3 guys and us 3 girls. We booked separate hotel rooms. The guys booked theirs early, which was smart, whereas I booked the room for the girls very last minute. I didn't realize then that the rooms would all be booked up near the convention center. Needless to say, there were almost no affordable rooms left. I had a mini panic attack before I finally found a shitty Super 8 in Chinatown with a room left. I asked if any of the other gals minded, and they were totally fine with it, as we wouldn't be staying at the hotel much anyways. Fast forward to us arriving there. It was literally inside an Asian strip mall. It was extremely sketchy, but hey, what could we do now? We checked in, unpacked, and headed down to the convention center to set up our supplies. Afterwards, a bunch of other tattooers asked us all out for drinks. All 6 of us said sure, and we met up at a bar together. We had a pretty great night actually, and everyone was having a full-on blast. I was really not used to drinking at all though, and it was getting later and later. Being my first convention, I didn't want to be tired and hungover the next day, so I asked if anyone wanted to leave with me. They were all still partying though and didn't want to go. I didn't want to ruin their fun time, so I let them know I'd be heading back myself. I called up an Uber. When I got back, it was completely empty. I walked through the entire mall complex, and it was silent and dark. I made it to the hotel entrance and walked past the check-in desk. Dark there. It seemed no one was around anywhere. I was starting to get a bit creeped out and was kind of looking around nervously. I took the elevator to my floor and walked past the communal breakfast area. This is where scary shit started to happen. The breakfast room was pitch black, but I could see the silhouette of a man just sitting in there alone. When the man saw me, he stood up, and I could hear his footsteps creeping up behind me. I tried to stay calm. I told myself he was probably just heading to his own room. You're freaking out for no reason just because it's late. As I continued down those dark halls trying to find my room though, I decided for whatever reason to turn around. That led to the most disgusting sight I've ever seen. The doors for each room dipped into the wall slightly, you see. As I turned around, I shit you not, the man behind me dipped into one of the doorways out of sight, then peered at me from behind the wall. We made direct eye contact, and my heart fell into my stomach. I turned back around and started walking faster to get back to my room and lock the door. I was almost there now. I was at the T intersection of the hallway. There was a fire extinguisher behind glass in front of me. I could see the man following behind me in the reflection. I turned around again, only to see him dip behind some furniture and peek at me from behind it. At that point, I absolutely lost it. I started running and booked it the last few meters to my room around the corner. I swiped my keycard so fast, I'm surprised I didn't fumble and drop it. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it up tight. Thank God I turned a corner, because it seemed he hadn't seen which room was actually mine. I looked through the peephole in the door and watched him pace around the hall for a good 10 minutes before walking away. I immediately went to the hotel room phone to try and call security, but no one was answering. I called my coworkers, who were still at the bar, and told them what had happened too. They came right away and helped me find an employee. I guess they had next to no staff overnight, and no security whatsoever. The employee we did find tried to look for the guy, but of course he was long gone by now. He told me he'd checked the cameras, but I never heard if anything came from that. I don't know what would have happened if that guy had caught me, and I'm sure glad that I didn't have to find out. Every year, I like to take my family on vacation, so we can all have an enjoyable week of relaxation and bonding time together. We usually stay in hotels, but after having a third kid with my wife, we decided it would be best to stay in a house. Our 7-month-old son would often cry and throw tantrums most nights, and I figured that would be very inconvenient for the other guests. I'd never stayed in an Airbnb before, but I decided I would give it a shot, since my coworkers all spoke very highly of it. After getting used to navigating the site, I started to narrow down my search within a couple of cities that my wife and I thought would be nice to visit. I was excited when I found this beautiful house that went for a decently low nightly rate. It was just a short walk away from the ocean as well. In addition, there were shopping plazas where we'd be able to get our groceries for the week just a short drive away. I looked over the host's rating on the website, a middle-aged man named Tom. I was very happy to see he was consistently given a 5-star rating. I booked the house for 7 days, officially planning out our trip. After a super long car ride there, we finally pulled up to the home around 10:30 on the Friday we scheduled to check in. The house was pitch black and surrounded on all sides by woods, gave off a real eerie vibe. We followed the emailed instructions given to us from Tom to get into the home. We typed in the garage code and walked to the safe in the corner of the garage to enter the code to get the key. We got inside without too much trouble and began to unpack our things. The house was huge, having 6 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms. Quite an upgrade to our own humble abode. My wife and I noticed the air smelled a bit musty inside, but we assumed that nobody else stayed here the week prior or something. We all brought our luggage up the stairs and picked out our rooms. Our 2 sons stayed in the same bedroom at the end of the hall, while my wife and I took the master bedroom, putting our baby in the room directly next to us. We were all quite exhausted from all this traveling, and probably went to bed around 11:30 or so. At some point during the night, though, I was awakened to hear my son talking to his mom next to our bed, saying that he'd heard a bunch of scary noises. My wife calmed him down and tucked him back in. This wasn't something uncommon. Our sons were both 5 years old and would often get spooked at night. I dozed off again pretty quickly. I was awoken once more by the sound of both of our sons running to our room crying this time. They both insisted they'd heard footsteps coming from above them. I decided I'd flip on the lights to get up and walk around with them to show them they were safe and nothing was there. After doing this, they relaxed a bit and I laid back down to go to bed. After I closed their door though, I checked around once more, feeling a bit concerned now. I opened the door by their rooms that led to the attic and walked up the steps. I saw that the door at the top of the stairs was locked, which didn't surprise me. Within minutes of crawling back into bed though, I heard screaming coming from my son's room. I sprinted out of bed and down the hallway and threw open the door to their room. I flipped on the lights. I could see both of my sons laying on their beds hiding under their covers. I walked over to them and asked what was wrong. Their response was very unsettling to hear. One son told me he'd heard their door creak open and seen a shadow of someone staring in at him right outside. Something about the tone in his voice and the terrified look in his eyes told me he was not just making this up. Normally, I would just think this was one of their night terrors since we were staying in a foreign place, but with this being the 3rd time now, I couldn't help but believe what they were saying. By now, my wife was standing in the room with us. She'd heard everything. I asked her to take everyone into our room and stay there. I did have a concealed carry license and usually carried my gun with me, but this time I'd left it back at home not thinking I'd need it. Now I regretted not having it with me. I knew I'd have to search the house with nothing. As I crept downstairs to the main floor in the dark, I felt a bit scared. It was pitch black and completely silent. The sound of my breath and the light footsteps on the ground were the only sounds I could hear. They felt quite loud, despite my efforts to stay silent. I knew the light switch was somewhere at the bottom of the stairs. I fumbled around in the dark for a minute until I finally found it and flipped it on. My jaw dropped as I looked around and noticed that the front door to the house was wide open. I knew I had made sure the doors were all closed and locked before we went to bed. I slammed it shut, locked it again, and ran upstairs to inform my wife and kids as I locked the master bedroom door behind me. She dialed 911.
They said they would have officers there soon. We were instructed to stay inside the room no matter what. Even though it was now 2:30 in the morning, I called the Airbnb owner to let him know there was some sort of break-in. I dialed his number and put it on speaker so my wife could hear him too if he picked up. What we heard next still haunts me to this day. All of a sudden, I could hear a faint ringing coming out from above us in the attic. It sounded immediately as I called him. My wife and I both looked at each other in total shock, knowing the house owner's phone was in the attic. The police arrived minutes after, and we explained everything that had happened. We booked a hotel that night, which was a short drive away from the Airbnb, and enjoyed the rest of our vacation. We eventually followed up with the police, wondering if they'd attained any further information. Turns out Tom, the owner of the Airbnb, was in the attic that night walking around, which explains why our sons had heard those noises. He'd snuck down and opened the door to our son's room, but hid as my wife and I had gotten up after hearing our sons screaming. As we passed one of the rooms on the way down the hall, he crept down the stairs and ran away. Finally, we learned the attic had several monitors hooked up to secret cameras around the house, so he was able to see and hear everything. It was quite a horrifying experience as a first-time Airbnb guest, and I plan to only rent hotels from now on. The following is a true story that happened in the early 1990s when I was about 14 and lived with my parents. When I was 13 years old, my dad worked for a government contractor, and his work moved us from our hometown to another location about 200 miles away. To me, it seemed out in the middle of nowhere. We moved over my 9th grade year, but my dad moved first to find a place for us to live while our old house sold. We ended up staying in a rental for a short period of time, so my parents could find the right house to stay. After a few months went by, my parents finally found a place. Where we lived before, my hometown was a suburb and super expensive at the time. Where we moved to, the land and homes were a lot cheaper, so my parents took good advantage of that and bought a huge home. We went from a single-story, 3-bedroom, 1-bath house to a 5-bedroom, 3-bath, 2-story home. I didn't get to see the house before my parents put the offer, as they went home shopping while I was still at my new school. I remember when they drove by for the first time to show us the new house. It looked like a mansion compared to our other one. Although I did miss all my friends and my old neighborhood, this house looked so cool. It was in the oldest part of the city, as there was a lot of new construction going up all around. My parents had apparently got a really good deal on this home. Once we went inside, I knew why. It was evening when my parents got the keys to the new house, so by the time we met the realtor and drove over, it was dark outside, which made it all the more creepy. When we walked in, it was like a time capsule, like everything was frozen in the 1960s. It also had this musty old smell, like the place had been vacant and non-touched for years. Much later, I found out that in fact it had been sitting vacant for 8 years before we'd bought it. Even before that, it was odd the previous owners had never updated anything about the house. There was shag carpet everywhere, the appliances were all from the 60s, and the paint in the rooms was weird colors and peeling off. It looked like a crash pad for hippies or something. My dad was very handy, thankfully, so immediately they got to work renovating everything. My dad called in a lot of family help. Eventually, it was completely renovated, and we moved in. I had always felt uneasy in certain parts of the house. I could never explain it, but things like shadows appearing, lights turning on and off, even my sister's hairdryer turning on at 2 a.m. by itself one time. The thing that happened the most, though, was footsteps. I would hear them coming downstairs at night when everything was quiet. Fast forward to a year after we'd moved in. I was the first to notice something odd in the house. This started when I asked my parents to move to an upstairs room because it was bigger and had a walk-in closet. They agreed, of course. I started thinking about the layout of the house upstairs. You see, there was this big open room that was a majority of the upstairs space. We used it as a living room. At the end of the hallway that went to 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, The layout didn't make much sense. There was a void behind the other bathroom that was adjacent to mine. In fact, it was big enough room for another bedroom entirely, but that space went out over the garage. One day, I drew out our house like a diagram. I couldn't figure out why there would be such a big void there with nothing in it. I asked my dad and he kinda shrugged it off. One day, I went outside to that side of the house to scope a bit further and noticed something odd. It appeared there had once been a window there or something. It was covered up by some big vent-looking thing and a sloppy patch of stucco. At this point, I was super curious. I studied the layout once more and noticed the wall on the other side of the bathroom had a patch of drywall in the shape of a doorway. I must be right. There was another room here, but why had it been sealed off? Obviously, my dad would have killed me if I just broke open the drywall, so I had an idea. I wasn't sure if it would work. One day when my parents were away visiting my aunt and uncle, I opted to stay home. I knew they would be gone for hours because of the distance. I figured out that if I went up to the attic crawl space above the garage and broke through the drywall there, my dad might not notice that I'd done so. I doubted he'd ever go up there on his own. I grabbed some tools with me and began to cut through the drywall. Eventually, I made an opening big enough to crawl through between the studs. I was right. There was another room of our house hidden here. I was half excited and half terrified. I was excited I was right, but after looking around the room, it was obvious it had been a bedroom at one point in time. The walls were an old pink color, and the carpet had been completely pulled up. There was no padding, just the strips that tacked the carpet to the ground. I could see where they'd closed off the doorway. There were no doors to the closet in that room either. It looked like at one time there had been something on the wall, but it had been ripped off. The only other thing I found in there were cigarette butts and old beer cans. Must have been either early 70s or 80s. Like I'd seen from the outside, there was also a place where a window had been removed. Some metal vent was nailed into place to cover the opening. I only had a cheap flashlight with me, and even though it was during the day, the room was pitch black inside. I started to get a real creepy feeling being inside here. The smell was very off. I got out of there and tried to make an excuse for going up to the crawl space. I started moving boxes of old junk up there, so I could tell my parents I was cleaning the garage and had found it. When my parents got home, I made up some story I was putting boxes away and noticed a hole. They didn't get mad or anything. They eventually came clean that the realtor told them about the room. I was like, hey, let's open it up and make this a 6th bedroom in the house. My dad refused, said to just leave it alone. Eventually, some time passed. On occasion, I would take friends up there to see this mystery room. After I opened it up, though, things in the house started to get even creepier. Footsteps going all the time. The ones walking up and down the stairs would be louder. There was more shadows appearing in the shape of people. One time, a family friend screamed because she said she saw a woman in the mirror as she was walking up the stairs. She thought it was my mom, but when she turned, it disappeared. Another time, a friend who was sleeping over in the other room sprinted outside in the middle of the night so scared that he'd gone out in his boxers. Said someone had been standing over him while he was sleeping. When I was about 16, I happened to talk to an older neighbor, and he mentioned that he was one of the original owners in that neighborhood. I asked him about my house. He mentioned something about the son who used to live there going to prison back in the early 70s. Wouldn't go into details, but said it was really sad, and not to let drugs ruin your life. I looked up some old newspapers and stuff in the library, only to find an old article about a teen who'd killed his mother and attempted to kill his father before he was arrested. My family moved out shortly after I turned 17, and I never went back to that house again. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.